The man who wouldn't heal until he met Quill. The monitors insisted on their indifferent beeping when the door creaked open and a dark grey cat with amber eyes entered, as if he knew exactly where he needed to be. The man in the bed, skin pale, gaze fixed on the ceiling, medications proving useless, merely moved his fingers, the smallest sign of life. The cat leaped onto the foot of the bed and settled without ceremony. The beeping changed rhythm. There was silence before the almost inaudible murmur, "You also came here uninvited." That late afternoon, it wasn't medication that pierced through his armor, it was presence. And the story, until then written with forceps, gained a new pen. The cat had a name, an unlikely and memorable one: Quill. The community hospital in Portland, Oregon, smelled of antiseptic and lukewarm coffee. Outside, red leaves piled up on sidewalks. Inside, life seemed suspended. The patient, Edgar Mallory, 68 years old, former construction company owner, resisted more out of pride than illness. He didn't say, "I'm sick." He said, "I don't need anyone." His heart, however, couldn't read bravado. The staff saw a body under treatment and a soul on strike. Edgar had built his life like the houses his company constructed, solid, practical, designed to last. For 40 years, Mallory Construction had left its mark across Oregon's suburbs, each project a testament to his unwavering belief that problems had solutions, and solutions required nothing more than hard work and stubborn determination. His marriage to Catherine had been built on the same foundation, steady, reliable, built to weather any storm. When she died 3 years ago after a brief battle with cancer, Edgar discovered that some structures, no matter how carefully constructed, could collapse without warning. The heart attack had come on a Tuesday morning while he was reviewing blueprints for a project he'd never finish. The chest pain felt like his ribcage was being compressed in a vice, and the ambulance ride became a blur of sirens and worried voices asking questions he couldn't answer. Now, weeks later, Edgar lay in room 314 with a view of the parking lot, watching raindrops race down the window while nurses came and went with medications that seemed to make no difference. Dr. Sarah Chen had tried everything in her considerable arsenal. Beta blockers, ACE inhibitors, blood thinners. Edgar's body accepted them with mechanical compliance, but his spirit remained untouched. His daughter Miriam visited twice a week, sitting in the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside his bed, making conversation about weather and neighborhood gossip, while both of them avoided discussing the obvious. Edgar was giving up, and medical science couldn't cure a broken will to live. "Your numbers are improving," Dr. Chen would say during her morning rounds, reviewing his chart with the practiced optimism of someone who'd learned to find hope in small victories. "The cardiac function is stabilizing." Edgar would nod politely and return his gaze to the ceiling tiles, counting the small holes in the acoustic panels above his bed. 247 holes per tile, 16 tiles visible from his position. The mathematics of meaninglessness. The hospital operated on schedules Edgar had come to memorize. Breakfast at 7:30, morning medications at 9, physical therapy at 11, which he attended with the enthusiasm of a condemned man walking to the gallows, lunch at noon, visiting hours from 2 to 8, dinner at 6, evening medications at 9, lights out at 10. Between these markers, time moved like cold honey, thick and seemingly endless. It was during one of these interminable afternoons that Quill first appeared. The Portland Animal Shelter had been running a pet therapy program at the hospital for 2 years, bringing carefully screened and trained animals to visit patients who might benefit from the interaction. The program coordinator, an energetic woman named Lisa, who seemed to generate sunshine wherever she went, had mentioned it to Edgar several times. "Studies show that interaction with animals can lower blood pressure and improve recovery times," she'd explained, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who truly believed in her work. "We have dogs, cats, even a rabbit. Very gentle, very well trained." Edgar had politely declined each time. He'd never been particularly fond of pets. Catherine had wanted a dog when they were first married, but Edgar had convinced her that their busy schedules wouldn't be fair to an animal. Looking back, he realized it was just another way he'd chosen practicality over joy, efficiency over connection, but Lisa was persistent in the gentle way of people who'd made caring for others their life's work. The shelter had experienced a minor crisis the previous week, when a storm had damaged part of their facility, and several animals who were normally housed there were being rotated through extended therapy visits while repairs were made. It was bureaucratic necessity disguised as serendipity, and Edgar was too tired to maintain his resistance when Lisa appeared in his doorway with a pet carrier and a hopeful smile. "Just for an hour," she'd said. "If you don't like it, I'll take him right back." The cat that emerged from the carrier was unlike anything Edgar had expected. Quill was sleek and substantial, with fur the color of charcoal and eyes like amber gemstones. He moved with the fluid confidence of royalty, surveying the room with an intelligence that seemed almost human. Most remarkably, he showed no interest in the usual cat behaviors Edgar had observed in passing. No frantic exploration, no nervous hiding, no attention-seeking meowing. Instead, Quill simply looked at Edgar for a long moment, as if taking his measure, then leaped gracefully onto the bed and settled at Edgar's feet like he'd been doing it for years. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. The change in the room's atmosphere was immediate and inexplicable. The constant electronic humming of medical equipment seemed less oppressive. The antiseptic smell gave way to something warmer, more alive. Edgar found himself looking at the cat instead of the ceiling, and for the first time in weeks, the mathematics of meaninglessness gave way to simple curiosity. "What kind of name is Quill?" Edgar had asked Lisa, who was watching the interaction with barely concealed delight. "He came to us with that name," she'd explained. "Previous owner was a writer, apparently. Said the cat used to sit on his desk while he worked, like a living paperweight. When the gentleman passed away, his family brought Quill to us. He's been waiting for the right home." Edgar studied the cat, who was now purring with a sound like distant thunder. The vibration traveled through the hospital blankets and seemed to settle somewhere deep in Edgar's chest, a sensation he hadn't felt since Catherine used to rest her head on his shoulder while they watched television in the evenings. "So you also came here uninvited?" Edgar murmured, the words emerging before he could stop them. Quill's purring intensified, and one amber eye opened to regard Edgar with what seemed like amusement. In that moment, Edgar felt the first crack in the armor he'd built around his heart since Catherine's death. Not a painful fracture, but a gentle opening, like the first green shoot pushing through frozen ground. When the hour was up and Lisa returned to collect Quill, Edgar surprised himself by asking, Could he visit again tomorrow?" Lisa's smile could have powered the entire hospital. "I think that can be arranged." As the door closed behind them, Edgar realized he was looking forward to something for the first time in months. The monitors resumed their indifferent beeping, but somehow the sound no longer seemed quite so lonely. Outside, the Oregon rain continued its steady percussion against the window, but instead of counting ceiling tiles, Edgar found himself wondering what stories a cat named Quill might have to tell. The night shift nurse, checking on him at midnight, found Edgar sleeping peacefully for the first time since his admission. His vital signs had improved measurably. His breathing was deeper and more regular, and for reasons that would never appear in any medical chart, the man who had been dying of despair was beginning to remember how to live. Tomorrow would bring Quill back, and with him, the possibility that healing could come from the most unexpected sources. Edgar didn't know it yet, but his story was being rewritten, one gentle purr at a time. Quill arrived the next afternoon with the punctuality of a Swiss timepiece and the dignity of a diplomat. Edgar had been watching the clock since lunch, though he would have denied it to anyone who asked. When the familiar pet carrier appeared in his doorway, followed by Lisa's knowing smile, Edgar felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years, anticipation mixed with a kind of nervous joy, like a teenager waiting for his first date. "Someone's been asking about you all morning," Lisa said as she opened the carrier. The moment I mentioned your name, his ears perked up. Quill emerged with the same unhurried confidence as the day before, but this time he paused to acknowledge Lisa with a brief head bump against her hand before making his way to Edgar's bed. The routine was already establishing itself, a graceful leap, a moment of settling, then that remarkable purr that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than his small chest. Edgar had prepared conversation topics, the way he used to prepare for difficult client meetings. He'd thought about Catherine, about his company, about the strange loneliness of hospital rooms, but when Quill settled against his legs and fixed him with those amber eyes, Edgar found himself talking about things he hadn't thought about in decades. "I used to build houses," he said quietly, his hand moving tentatively toward Quill's head. The cat leaned into the touch as if he'd been waiting for it all along. "Started with nothing but a truck and a toolbox. Catherine thought I was crazy, taking on projects twice as big as anything I'd ever done before." The words came easier with each sentence, as if Quill's presence had unlocked some internal dam Edgar hadn't even realized existed. He talked about the early days when every job was a gamble, when he and Catherine would lie awake at night, calculating whether they had enough in the bank to cover supplies for the next project. He talked about the satisfaction of seeing families move into homes he'd built, how Catherine would insist on driving by their completed projects years later to see how the gardens had grown and how the houses had settled into their neighborhoods. "She wanted children," Edgar admitted, his voice growing softer. "We tried for years. Doctors said there was no medical reason why we couldn't. Sometimes these things just don't happen. I kept telling her we'd build our family differently, that we'd focus on the business, on each other. I thought I was being practical, but looking back, I think I was just scared." Quill's purring never wavered, a constant bass note of acceptance that made confession feel less like exposure and more like release. Edgar found himself describing Catherine's final months, how she'd insisted on maintaining normalcy, even as treatment sapped her strength, how she'd made him promise to keep living after she was gone. "I haven't done a very good job keeping that promise," Edgar said, his eyes fixed on Quill's fur as his fingers worked through the soft grey strands. "I kept the business running for about a year, but my heart wasn't in it. Sold everything 18 months ago. Been rattling around that empty house ever since, pretending I was fine." The confession hung in the air between them, and Edgar realized he'd told this cat things he'd never said aloud to anyone, not even to Miriam during her increasingly worried visits. There was something about Quill's steady presence that invited honesty without judgment, that seemed to absorb difficult truths without being overwhelmed by them. Dr. Chen appeared for her afternoon rounds, clipboard in hand and the slightly surprised expression she'd worn increasingly often since Quill's arrival. Edgar's vital signs continued to improve in ways that couldn't be explained by medication alone. His blood pressure had stabilized, his heart rate had become more regular, and his sleep patterns were returning to normal for the first time since his admission. "I hear you've been having a visitor," she said, scratching behind Quill's ears. The cat accepted the attention graciously, but didn't break his focus on Edgar. "Seems like it," Edgar replied, and Dr. Chen caught something in his tone that hadn't been there before. Not quite optimism, but the absence of the quiet despair that had colored every interaction since his arrival. "Animals have remarkable effects on healing," she said carefully. "We're seeing measurable improvements in your cardiovascular function. Sometimes the best medicine isn't something we can prescribe." That evening, after Quill had returned to the shelter, and Edgar was alone with the familiar sounds of the hospital settling into its night routine, he found himself thinking about the conversation with unprecedented clarity. For the first time since Catherine's death, he wasn't avoiding the future. He was actually wondering what it might hold. The revelation came 3 days later, during what had become Edgar's favorite hour of the day. Quill was sprawled across his legs with the boneless relaxation of complete trust, purring steadily while Edgar scratched behind his ears and talked about the challenges of running a construction business in a city where environmental regulations changed faster than building codes. "The thing about building," Edgar was saying, "is that you have to balance what people want with what they actually need. Catherine was better at that than I was. She'd look at a family and somehow know exactly how they lived, what spaces they'd use, what would make them happy." Quill's purring intensified, and he stretched one paw toward Edgar's hand in what seemed like encouragement to continue. "I miss that," Edgar admitted. "Not just Catherine, though God knows I miss her every day. I miss building things that mattered. I miss having purpose. I miss feeling useful." The words surprised him with their clarity. For months, Edgar had told himself that his emptiness was grief, pure and simple, the natural response to losing someone central to his life. But talking to Quill was helping him understand that his pain was more complex than simple loss. He missed Catherine desperately, but he also missed the version of himself that had existed in relationship with her, the Edgar who had been partner and provider, builder and protector. "I don't know how to be useful anymore," he said quietly. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with whatever time I have left." Quill opened one amber eye and regarded Edgar with what seemed like gentle reproach. Then, in a gesture that would later strike Edgar as almost impossibly perfect, The cat stood up, walked the length of Edgar's body and settled himself directly over Edgar's heart, his purr vibrating against Edgar's chest like a small, furry engine of comfort. The physical sensation was remarkable. Warmth, weight and vibration combining to create something Edgar hadn't felt since Catherine used to fall asleep in his arms. But more than the physical comfort was the emotional message. You are useful right now. You are needed right here. This moment, this connection, this simple act of caring, this matters. Edgar's eyes filled with tears for the first time since Catherine's funeral, but they weren't tears of despair. They were tears of recognition, the emotional equivalent of coming home after a long journey, to find that home was still there, still waiting, still ready to shelter whatever was left of your heart. The breakthrough came during the weekend, when hospital routines relaxed slightly and visitors were allowed to stay longer. Miriam arrived for her usual Saturday visit to find her father sitting up in bed, alert and engaged in a way she hadn't seen since before his heart attack. "Dad?" she said uncertainly, taking in the scene. Edgar with a cat draped across his lap, both of them looking remarkably content. "Miriam, I'd like you to meet Quill," Edgar said, and there was something in his voice that made Miriam step closer, her usual defensive posture softening despite herself. "Quill, this is my daughter." Miriam had prepared herself for another difficult visit, another exercise in forced optimism, while her father stared at the ceiling with the expression of someone who'd given up on living. Instead, she found herself sitting in the visitor's chair while her father told her about pet therapy, about conversations with a cat that seemed to understand everything, about the slow process of remembering who he used to be beneath the grief. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Edgar said, his hand moving gently through Quill's fur. "I can't go back to the way things were before Catherine died. That version of my life is over. But maybe there's a different version, something I haven't considered." Miriam felt her throat tighten. For 3 years she'd watched her father disappear into a kind of living grief, going through the motions of existence without any apparent joy or purpose. She'd tried everything she could think of, inviting him to family dinners, suggesting activities, even arranging for him to volunteer at a local Habitat for Humanity chapter. Nothing had penetrated the wall he'd built around himself. Now, watching him interact with this remarkable cat, she saw glimpses of the father she remembered from childhood, patient, thoughtful, capable of gentleness. Quill seemed to bring out qualities in Edgar that had been buried beneath months of self-imposed isolation. "What are you thinking about?" she asked carefully. Edgar was quiet for a long moment, his fingers working through Quill's fur, while the cat purred steadily against his legs. When he spoke, his voice carried a tentative quality, like someone testing whether a new idea could bear weight. "Lisa, that's the coordinator for the pet therapy program. She mentioned that the shelter is always looking for volunteers, people to help with socialization, training, matching animals with families." He paused, glancing at Miriam as if gauging her reaction. "I've been thinking that maybe I could do something like that. Once I'm better, I mean." Miriam felt tears prick her eyes. The suggestion was so perfectly suited to her father's personality, practical, helpful, focused on building connections, that she wondered why none of them had thought of it before. "I think that sounds wonderful, Dad." Edgar's smile was small but genuine, the first truly happy expression Miriam had seen from him in years. Quill chose that moment to stretch and resettle himself, his purr intensifying, as if in approval of the conversation. That night, after visiting hours ended and Quill had returned to the shelter, Edgar lay in the familiar darkness of his hospital room with a sense of possibility he hadn't experienced since Catherine's diagnosis. The monitors continued their quiet beeping, but instead of counting ceiling tiles, Edgar found himself planning. He thought about what it might feel like to help match animals with families, to be part of the process that brought the kind of connection he'd found with Quill into other people's lives. He thought about learning the individual personalities of cats and dogs waiting for homes, about becoming someone animals could trust, about finding purpose in the simple act of caring for creatures who needed care. For the first time in months, Edgar fell asleep thinking about tomorrow not as something to be endured, but as something to be anticipated. Outside, the Oregon rain continued its gentle percussion against the hospital windows, but it no longer sounded like loneliness. It sounded like possibility, like the first notes of a song he was just beginning to learn how to sing. The discussion about discharge began on a Tuesday morning that arrived with unprecedented sunshine streaming through Edgar's hospital window. Dr. Chen entered room 314 with his chart and an expression that managed to convey both satisfaction and concern, the look of a doctor who'd witnessed an unexpected recovery but remained professionally cautious about declaring victory too early. "Your numbers are remarkable," she said, settling into the visitor's chair while Quill observed from his usual position across Edgar's legs. "Heart function is stable, blood pressure is within normal range, and your exercise tolerance has improved significantly. Medically speaking, you're ready to go home." Edgar felt a flutter of anxiety that had nothing to do with his cardiac condition. Home meant the empty house he'd shared with Catherine, the rooms that echoed with the absence of her laughter, the silence that had driven him to spend most of his time in the garage workshop, pretending to organize tools that were already perfectly organized. "How soon?" he asked, though what he really wanted to ask was whether Quill could somehow come with him, a question that seemed both impossible and desperately necessary. "End of the week, assuming your stress test results remain stable. We'll set you up with outpatient cardiac rehabilitation, medication management, and regular follow-ups. The transition back to normal life can be challenging after a major cardiac event, but you seem to have found something that's working for you." Dr. Chen's eyes moved to Quill, who was watching the conversation with the alert interest of someone who understood that important decisions were being made. "Lisa mentioned you're interested in volunteering with the pet therapy program once you're recovered. I've been thinking about it," Edgar said carefully, "if I'm physically up to it." "I think it would be excellent therapy for you," Dr. Chen replied. "Purpose and social connection are often the best medicine for recovery. We'll make sure you're cleared for that level of activity." After Dr. Chen left, Edgar found himself staring out the window at the parking lot where, in a few days, Miriam would pick him up and drive him back to a life he was no longer sure how to live. The prospect of leaving Quill behind felt like another kind of loss, smaller than losing Catherine but sharp in its own way. "What am I going to do without you?" he asked aloud, his hand working through Quill's fur with the automatic gesture of someone who'd grown accustomed to the comfort of constant contact. Quill's response was to stand, walk up Edgar's chest with careful precision, and settle himself directly over Edgar's heart, with the weight of a small, warm promise. The message was clear. "You'll figure it out. You're stronger than you think." The obstacles began revealing themselves almost immediately. Edgar's house, a modest ranch-style structure he and Catherine had bought 30 years earlier, felt like a museum of his former life when Miriam drove him home on Friday afternoon. Every surface held reminders of routines that no longer existed. Catherine's reading glasses on the kitchen counter, the coffee maker programmed for 2 cups, photographs from company Christmas parties, and weekend trips that seemed to belong to different people entirely. Miriam had done her best to prepare the space, stocking the refrigerator with easy meals and arranging Edgar's medications in a weekly pill organizer with the kind of thoughtful efficiency that reminded Edgar painfully of Catherine. But all the practical preparation in the world couldn't address the fundamental problem. This house had been designed for 2 people, and Edgar had never learned how to live in it alone. The first night was the worst. Edgar lay in the king-sized bed he'd shared with Catherine, staring at the ceiling of his own bedroom and listening to sounds that had once been comforting, the refrigerator cycling on, the automatic sprinkler system in the backyard, the distant hum of traffic on the main road. Without the steady beeping of hospital monitors and the knowledge that someone would check on him every few hours, the house felt not like a sanctuary, but like an echo chamber of his own isolation. He found himself missing Quill with an intensity that surprised him. It wasn't just the cat's physical presence he longed for, but the sense of purpose that came with caring for another living creature, the feeling that his attention and affection were needed and appreciated. Edgar had spent 40 years as Catherine's husband and 30 years as the owner of a construction company, roles that had given him clear responsibilities and obvious ways to measure success. Now he was simply Edgar Mallory, cardiac patient and widower, and he had no idea how to fill the hours between waking and sleeping. By the 3rd day home, Edgar was seriously considering the possibility that leaving the hospital had been a mistake. He'd attended 1 session of outpatient cardiac rehabilitation, a group exercise program held in a fluorescent-lit room that smelled of disinfectant and determination. The other participants were friendly enough: a retired teacher recovering from bypass surgery, a postal worker who'd had a stent placement, a grandmother who'd survived a minor heart attack while babysitting her granddaughter. But their shared medical experience felt insufficient to bridge the gap between Edgar's private grief and their cautious optimism about recovery. The medication routine Dr. Chen had prescribed was manageable, but served as a constant reminder of his changed circumstances. Every morning and evening, Edgar counted out pills that were meant to keep his heart beating steadily, his blood flowing smoothly, his body functioning efficiently. The irony wasn't lost on him. Medical science could regulate his cardiovascular system with remarkable precision, but it couldn't address the fact that he had no compelling reason to want his heart to keep beating. It was during one particularly difficult evening, Edgar sitting in the living room, surrounded by Catherine's carefully chosen furniture and the oppressive quiet of a house designed for conversation, that the phone rang with a call that would change everything. "Edgar? This is Lisa from the pet therapy program at the hospital." Edgar's grip tightened on the receiver. "Is Quill all right?" "Quill is fine," Lisa assured him quickly, and Edgar could hear the smile in her voice. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. I know you've only been home a few days, but I wanted to discuss something with you. Quill has been, well, he's been different since you left. Not eating as well, not as engaged during therapy visits. It's almost like he's looking for someone." Edgar felt his throat tighten. "I've been missing him too. I was wondering if you'd be interested in fostering him," Lisa said carefully. "Just temporarily, while we find him a permanent home. It would give you a chance to see how you feel about having a pet, and it might help both of you adjust to your new circumstances." The suggestion hit Edgar like a physical force, a combination of hope and terror that left him momentarily speechless. The practical obstacles seemed overwhelming. He'd never owned a pet, didn't know anything about cat care, wasn't sure he could handle the responsibility of keeping another living creature safe and healthy. But beneath the anxiety was something else, a spark of the same anticipation he'd felt every afternoon when Quill appeared in his hospital doorway. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. "I don't know anything about taking care of cats," Edgar said finally. "We provide everything you need, food, litter, toys, a carrying case, and I'm always available for questions. The shelter would handle all veterinary care, and if it doesn't work out for any reason, we'll find him another placement immediately. No pressure, no judgment." Edgar looked around his empty living room, at the chairs Catherine had chosen because they were comfortable for two people to sit and talk, at the coffee table that now held only his medications and the remote control for a television he rarely watched. "What would I need to do?" Lisa's voice brightened with obvious relief. "Just love him. And maybe talk to him the way you did in the hospital. I think you both could use the company." The process moved with surprising speed. By the end of the week, Edgar found himself sitting in his living room while Lisa set up a litter box in the laundry room and arranged food and water bowls in the kitchen. Quill emerged from his carrier with the same dignified confidence Edgar remembered, pausing to survey his new surroundings before making his way directly to Edgar's chair. The reunion was everything Edgar had hoped it would be, and more. Quill leaped into his lap with the familiarity of long practice, settling himself with the satisfied sigh of someone who'd finally returned home after an extended absence. His purr filled the quiet house with warmth and life, transforming the oppressive silence into something that felt like companionship. "Well," Edgar said softly, his hand moving automatically to scratch behind Quill's ears, "I guess we're roommates now." The first few days of cohabitation were a process of mutual adjustment. Edgar learned that cats were far more complex creatures than he'd imagined, each with distinct preferences and personalities. Quill, it turned out, was particular about his food temperature. Slightly warm was preferred. Liked to sleep in patches of sunlight that moved across the living room floor throughout the day, and had strong opinions about which chair was most suitable for their afternoon conversation sessions. Edgar found himself developing routines around Quill's needs and preferences, and for the first time since Catherine's death, his days had structure that felt meaningful rather than arbitrary. Morning meant feeding Quill and making coffee for himself, then settling in the living room to read the newspaper, while Quill groomed himself in the patch of sunlight by the window. Afternoons were for talking. Edgar had resumed the one-sided conversations that had begun in the hospital, sharing stories and thoughts with Quill's steady, amber-eyed attention. But the most remarkable change was in the quality of Edgar's sleep. With Quill curled up on the bed beside him, purring steadily in the darkness, the house no longer felt empty. Edgar found himself sleeping through the night for the first time since his heart attack, waking rested and with something to look forward to. making breakfast for two, even if one of the diners preferred his meal from a bowl on the floor. The real test came during Edgar's first follow-up appointment with Dr. Chen. Quill had been with him for 2 weeks, and Edgar was curious to see whether the improvement he felt subjectively would be reflected in his medical tests. "This is remarkable," Dr. Chen said, reviewing his latest blood work and EKG results. "Your inflammatory markers are down, your resting heart rate has improved, and your blood pressure is the best it's been since your initial cardiac event. What's different about your routine?" Edgar thought about mentioning the regular schedule that had developed around caring for Quill, the sense of purpose that came with being needed, the comfort of consistent companionship. Instead, he simply said, "I got a cat." Dr. Chen laughed, but when she looked at Edgar's test results again, her expression grew thoughtful. "The cardiovascular benefits of pet ownership are well documented. Reduced stress hormones, lower blood pressure, improved immune function. It sounds like this animal is excellent medicine for you." That evening, Edgar sat in his living room with Quill draped across his legs, thinking about the unexpected ways life could change. 6 months ago, he'd been a man preparing to die of loneliness, going through the motions of existence without any real engagement with the world around him. Now he was learning to be something he'd never been before: a pet owner, a caregiver, someone whose daily routine revolved around the needs and comfort of another living creature. It wasn't the life he'd planned or the future he'd imagined, but it was a life with purpose, connection, and the kind of quiet joy he'd thought was lost forever when Catherine died. And at the center of it all was Quill, purring steadily against his legs like a small engine of contentment, proof that healing could come from the most unexpected sources. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, crisp and official, bearing the logo of Edgar's Homeowners Association. He opened it, while Quill sat in his usual spot on the kitchen table, watching with the alert attention of someone who could sense that important news was being delivered, even if he couldn't read the words himself. "Dear Mr. Mallory," Edgar read aloud, his voice growing tighter with each sentence, "it has come to our attention that you may be housing a pet in violation of the community covenants established in 1987, Section 4. 3 of the HOA agreement specifically prohibits the keeping of cats, dogs or other domestic animals within residential units. We must ask that you remedy this situation within 30 days to avoid potential fines and legal action." Edgar set the letter down with hands that shook slightly, not from his cardiac condition, but from a combination of anger and fear that felt disturbingly familiar. It was the same helpless fury he'd experienced during Catherine's illness, when insurance companies had denied coverage for treatments, when bureaucratic procedures had stood between his wife and the care she needed. Now, once again, institutional rules were threatening to separate him from something essential to his well-being. Quill seemed to sense the change in Edgar's emotional state. The cat stood, stretched with feline precision, and walked the length of the table to head bump against Edgar's hand, a gesture that had become their standard method of comfort and reassurance. "They want me to get rid of you," Edgar said quietly, scratching behind Quill's ears with automatic gentleness. 30 days to remedy the situation, as if you're a problem to be solved instead of the best thing that's happened to me in 3 years. Edgar's first instinct was to fight, the same combative response that had served him well in the construction business when clients changed their minds mid-project or suppliers tried to renegotiate contracts. He'd built his career on the principle that most problems had solutions if you were willing to work hard enough and push back against unreasonable obstacles. But this felt different, more personal, more fragile than any business dispute. The HOA rules were clear and had been established long before Edgar had any reason to care about pet ownership. When he and Catherine had bought the house 30 years earlier, the no pets policy had seemed irrelevant, just another line item in a contract full of restrictions they'd never expected to encounter. Now it felt like a trap he'd walked into unknowingly, a bureaucratic snare that threatened to destroy the fragile sense of purpose he'd only recently discovered. Edgar spent the afternoon researching his options with the methodical thoroughness he'd once applied to construction projects. He read through the HOA covenants, looking for loopholes or exceptions. He researched fair housing laws, hoping to find some provision for emotional support animals or therapeutic companions. He even considered consulting a lawyer, though the potential cost of legal action against his own homeowners association seemed both prohibitive and absurd. By evening, Edgar had reached a conclusion that felt both terrifying and inevitable. If the HOA wouldn't allow him to keep Quill, he'd have to find somewhere else to live. The idea of moving seemed overwhelming at first, selling the house he'd shared with Catherine, packing up 30 years of accumulated memories, starting over somewhere new at the age of 68. But as Edgar sat in his living room with Quill purring steadily against his legs, he realized that the house itself had become less important than the life he was building inside it. The walls held memories of Catherine, but they weren't Catherine herself. The rooms contained reminders of their shared past, but they weren't preventing him from building a different kind of future. "What do you think?" Edgar asked Quill. "Ready to try somewhere new?" Quill's response was to resettle himself more firmly across Edgar's lap, as if claiming permanent residence not in the house, but in Edgar's life itself. The search for pet-friendly housing proved more challenging than Edgar had anticipated. Most apartment complexes that allowed cats required deposits and monthly pet fees that seemed designed to discourage animal ownership rather than accommodate it. The available houses within Edgar's budget were either too large for his needs or located in neighborhoods that felt impersonal and sterile compared to the community he was leaving. It was Miriam who suggested contacting the Senior Services Department at the county office, and it was there that Edgar learned about a city program designed to help older adults find affordable housing that met their changing needs. The program coordinator, a patient woman named Janet who seemed genuinely interested in matching people with appropriate living situations, had several suggestions that Edgar hadn't considered. "Have you thought about senior living communities that allow pets?" Janet asked during their meeting at the county office. "There are several in the area that specifically welcome animals as therapeutic companions. Some even have on-site veterinary services." The idea of senior living had never appealed to Edgar. It suggested resignation, an acknowledgement that his active life was over and he was simply waiting for the inevitable decline of old age. But as Janet described communities designed around the principle that aging adults deserved independence, purpose, and companionship, Edgar found himself reconsidering his assumptions. "Would I be able to volunteer with animal therapy programs?" he asked. "That's something I've been thinking about doing once I'm fully recovered. Many of our partner communities actually coordinate with local animal shelters and therapy programs," Janet explained. "Some residents become certified therapy animal handlers themselves. It sounds like you might be particularly interested in Riverside Gardens. They have an active partnership with the Portland Animal Shelter, and several residents volunteer with their programs." Edgar left the meeting with a folder full of information and something he hadn't expected: excitement about the possibility of change. The prospect of living somewhere designed to support the kind of life he wanted to build, rather than simply maintaining the remnants of the life he'd already lived, felt like a revelation. Riverside Gardens turned out to be nothing like Edgar's preconceptions about senior living. The community was arranged around a central courtyard with walking paths, raised garden beds, and plenty of benches positioned to catch the afternoon sun. The apartments were small but well designed, with large windows and balconies that overlooked either the gardens or the nearby Willamette River. Most importantly, the community not only welcomed pets but celebrated them. Edgar's tour guide pointed out a small dog park, scratching posts installed in common areas, and bulletin boards covered with photos of residents with their animal companions. "We've found that pets contribute significantly to the overall health and happiness of our community," explained Sandra, the community coordinator who was showing Edgar around. "Residents with animals tend to be more social, more active, and generally more engaged with community life. We actually encourage pet ownership as part of our wellness philosophy." The apartment Edgar toured was on the second floor, with a balcony that caught the morning sun and a clear view of the river. It was smaller than his house, just one bedroom, a living area, and a compact kitchen, but it felt bright and welcoming in a way his current house never had, even in its happiest days with Catherine. "The rent includes all utilities, basic cable, and access to community programs," Sandra explained. "We have a shuttle service for shopping and medical appointments, an on-site fitness center, and organized activities for residents who are interested. But there's no pressure to participate if you prefer a quieter lifestyle." What convinced Edgar wasn't the amenities or the convenience, but the feeling he got watching other residents interact with their pets in the common areas. He saw an elderly woman teaching her small terrier to navigate a makeshift agility course in the dog park, laughing with the uninhibited joy of someone who'd found purpose in play. He observed a man about his own age sitting on a bench with a calico cat in his lap, both of them watching birds at a feeder, with the peaceful contentment of beings who knew they were exactly where they belonged. "I'd like to put in an application," Edgar told Sandra, surprising himself with the speed of his decision. The waiting list was shorter than expected, just 6 weeks, and Edgar found himself moving faster than he'd planned toward a future that felt both frightening and promising. The process of sorting through 30 years of accumulated possessions proved both emotional and liberating. Some items went to charity, others to Miriam for safekeeping, and still others directly to the garbage, with the ruthless efficiency of someone who'd learned to distinguish between what was truly important and what was simply familiar. Quill supervised the packing process from various strategic positions throughout the house, seeming to understand that significant changes were underway. Edgar found himself talking to the cat even more than usual during those weeks, explaining his decisions and seeking the kind of wordless approval that only Quill could provide. "The new place will be smaller," Edgar told him one afternoon while sorting through boxes in the garage, "but it'll be ours and nobody can tell us we don't belong there." The move itself took place on a surprisingly warm day in late February, with Miriam coordinating the logistics and Edgar focusing on keeping Quill calm during the transition. The cat handled the disruption with remarkable equanimity, settling into his carrying case without protest and emerging in the new apartment with the alert curiosity of someone ready to explore new territory. The first night in the new apartment, Edgar sat in his one comfortable chair, the same recliner he'd shared with Quill during their afternoon conversations, and watched his companion explore their new home with methodical thoroughness. Quill investigated every corner, tested the acoustics of the bathroom, and claimed the sunny spot by the balcony door with the satisfied air of someone who'd found exactly what he was looking for. "What do you think?" Edgar asked as Quill finally settled in his lap, purring with the steady contentment that had become the soundtrack of Edgar's recovery. Outside their window, the Willamette River caught the last light of day, and Edgar could hear the distant sounds of his new community settling in for the evening, doors closing, televisions murmuring, the soft bark of a dog being taken out for its final walk. It wasn't the life he'd planned or the home he'd shared with Catherine, but it was theirs, built around the simple recognition that sometimes the most important changes begin with the smallest acts of caring. Tomorrow would bring new routines, new neighbors, and new possibilities. But tonight, Edgar sat in his chair with Quill warm against his chest, listening to the sound of a cat's purr mixing with the gentle noise of a community where both of them were welcome, and felt something he hadn't experienced since Catherine's death, the deep satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged. Spring arrived early at Riverside Gardens, painting the courtyard with daffodils and cherry blossoms that seemed to announce the possibility of renewal to anyone willing to pay attention. Edgar had been living in his new apartment for 6 weeks, and the rhythm of community life was becoming as familiar as the sound of Quill's purring that still accompanied his morning coffee and evening reflections. The transition had been smoother than Edgar had dared to hope. His neighbors at Riverside Gardens were the kind of people who understood that everyone arrived there carrying stories of loss and change, and they approached new residents with a gentle curiosity that felt welcoming rather than intrusive. Mrs. Chen, no relation to his cardiologist, lived next door with an ancient tabby named Confucius and had become Edgar's unofficial guide to community life. Across the hall, Robert Martinez tended a small herb garden on his balcony and always had extra tomato seedlings to share with anyone interested in container gardening. Most importantly, Edgar's health continued to improve in ways that went beyond simple cardiovascular function. His latest checkup with Dr. Chen had revealed blood pressure readings that were better than they'd been in years, and his resting heart rate had settled into the steady rhythm of someone whose body was no longer fighting against chronic stress and isolation. "I hardly recognize you," Dr. Chen had said during his most recent visit, comparing his current test results to the baseline measurements taken during his hospitalization. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. The improvement is remarkable." What Edgar was doing was learning how to build a life around caring for Quill and, increasingly, around the volunteer work that had become the unexpected center of his new sense of purpose. The Portland Animal Shelter's volunteer training program had been more comprehensive than Edgar had expected. Over the course of 8 weeks, he'd learned about animal behavior, proper handling techniques, basic health assessment, and the complex psychology of matching pets with potential families. But the most valuable part of his education had come from working directly with animals waiting for homes, learning to read their individual personalities and needs. Edgar had discovered that he had an unexpected gift for working with older cats, the ones that potential adopters often passed over in favor of kittens. He seemed to understand something about the dignity of creatures who'd lived long enough to develop strong preferences and whose trust, once earned, became a precious gift. His specialty had become socializing cats who'd been surrendered after the death of elderly owners, animals who were grieving the loss of their humans just as intensely as Edgar had grieved the loss of Catherine. Working with these cats felt like a form of mutual therapy, each of them helping the other learn that attachment was still possible after profound loss. "You have a remarkable way with the seniors," Lisa had told him during his 3rd month as a volunteer. "Some of these cats haven't shown interest in human contact since they arrived, but they respond to you differently. Whatever you're doing, it's working." What Edgar was doing was approaching each cat with the patience and respect he wished someone had shown him during his own darkest period. He didn't try to force interaction or rush the process of building trust. Instead, he simply made himself available, sitting quietly in their enclosures and talking in the same gentle voice he used with Quill, letting each animal decide when and how they wanted to connect. The breakthrough that changed everything came on a Thursday afternoon in early May, when Edgar was working with a 12-year-old orange tabby named Winston, who'd been at the shelter for 4 months after his owner died of cancer. Winston had shown no interest in human contact since his arrival, spending his days huddled in the back corner of his enclosure and refusing to acknowledge the well-meaning volunteers who tried to coax him into interaction. Edgar had been visiting Winston twice a week for a month, simply sitting in the corner of the enclosure and reading aloud from the morning newspaper while the cat watched him with wary amber eyes, eyes that reminded Edgar painfully of Quill's steady gaze during those first hospital visits. On this particular Thursday, Edgar was reading an article about the city's plans for expanding green space along the river when Winston stood up, walked slowly across the enclosure, and settled himself just out of arm's reach from Edgar's chair. It wasn't dramatic, no Hollywood moment of sudden connection or miraculous transformation. It was just an old cat, deciding that this particular human might be trustworthy enough to share space with, a small act of faith that felt as significant as any grand gesture Edgar had ever witnessed. "Well, hello there, Winston," Edgar said quietly, not moving his hands toward the cat but continuing to read aloud. "Looks like you've decided I might be worth getting to know." Winston's response was to edge slightly closer, still maintaining a careful distance, but clearly interested in Edgar's presence. By the end of their session, the cat was sitting close enough that Edgar could see the silver threading through his orange fur, the slight cloudiness in his eyes that spoke of advancing age, the dignified way he held himself despite obvious arthritis in his hind legs. 2 weeks later, Winston was adopted by a retired librarian who'd been looking specifically for an older cat to share her quiet home. Edgar was there for the adoption meeting, watching as Winston allowed himself to be gently lifted into the carrier that would take him to his new life, and he felt a satisfaction that was deeper than any professional success he'd achieved during his construction career. "You did that," Lisa said, standing beside Edgar, as they watched Winston leave with his new family. 4 months, and he wouldn't let anyone touch him. 6 weeks with you, and he's ready to love again." Edgar felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. He just needed someone to understand that grief takes time. "So do people," Lisa said gently. "And speaking of which, I have a proposition for you." The proposition turned out to be an opportunity Edgar hadn't considered, but which felt like a natural next step in his journey. The shelter was launching a new program called Senior to Senior, designed specifically to match older animals with older adopters. They needed someone to coordinate the program, someone who understood both the challenges of aging and the therapeutic value of the human-animal bond. "It would be part-time, mostly afternoons," Lisa explained during their meeting in her office, "working with potential adopters, doing home visits, helping with the matching process. The pay isn't much, but it would formalize the work you're already doing so well." Edgar felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, the same nervousness he'd experienced when taking on his first major construction contract 40 years earlier. But beneath the anxiety was something else: excitement, purpose, the recognition that he was being offered a chance to transform his personal experience of healing into something that could benefit others. "I'd like to try it," he said finally. "Assuming Quill approves of the career change." Lisa laughed. "Something tells me Quill will be your biggest supporter." The first month of Edgar's new job confirmed Lisa's prediction. Quill seemed to understand that Edgar's volunteer work was important, and he'd developed the habit of positioning himself near the door when Edgar prepared to leave for the shelter, as if offering his blessing for the day's mission. In the evenings, Edgar would tell Quill about the cats he'd worked with, the potential adopters he'd met, the small victories and occasional setbacks that came with trying to build bridges between lonely animals and lonely people. The work was more complex than Edgar had anticipated, requiring skills he'd never known he possessed. Each potential adoption involved careful assessment of both the animal's needs and the adopter's lifestyle, followed by delicate negotiations to ensure the match would benefit everyone involved. Edgar found himself drawing on decades of experience in reading people, understanding their unspoken concerns, and helping them see past immediate obstacles to long-term possibilities. His first major success came when he matched a 13-year-old cat named Duchess with a widow named Eleanor, who'd been hesitant about adopting an older animal. Eleanor was concerned about veterinary costs, about the potential heartbreak of losing another companion, about whether she had enough energy to care for a pet at the age of 74. Edgar had spent 2 hours with Eleanor in the shelter's visiting room, watching her interact with Duchess, while they talked about the realities of pet ownership at their stage of life. He'd shared his own story, the heart attack, the depression, the way Quill had pulled him back from the edge of giving up entirely. "The thing about older cats," Edgar had told Eleanor while Duchess purred steadily in her lap, "is that they know what they want. They're not going to tear up your furniture or keep you awake all night. They just want a warm place to sleep and someone who understands that love doesn't always have to be energetic to be real." Eleanor had adopted Duchess that afternoon, and 3 months later, she sent Edgar a photo of the two of them napping together in a patch of sunlight, both looking thoroughly content with their decision to try again at companionship. As summer settled over Portland, Edgar found himself busier and more fulfilled than he'd been since Catherine's death. His mornings were spent with Quill in their bright apartment, his afternoons at the shelter working with cats and potential adopters, his evenings back at Riverside Gardens, where he'd become something of a celebrity for his success in placing older animals. The work had given him stories to share during the informal gatherings that happened most evenings in the community room, and Edgar discovered that he'd become someone other residents came to for advice about pet adoption, animal care, and the process of starting over after major life changes. But perhaps the most significant change was one that Edgar noticed only gradually, in quiet moments, when he caught himself planning beyond the immediate future. For the first time since Catherine's death, he was thinking in terms of years rather than days, building routines and relationships that assumed he would be around to maintain them. One evening in late August, Edgar sat on his balcony, watching the sun set over the Willamette River, while Quill dozed in his lap. The cat had gained weight since their move to Riverside Gardens. His coat had developed a glossy shine that spoke of good health and contentment, and his purr had taken on the deep, satisfied quality of an animal who knew himself to be thoroughly loved. "We did it," Edgar said quietly, scratching behind Quill's ears while the cat stretched and resetted himself more comfortably. "I don't know what Catherine would think of this life we've built, but I think she'd be proud that we figured out how to keep going." Quill's purr intensified, and Edgar realized that for the first time since his wife's death, the thought of Catherine brought comfort rather than pain. Not because the grief was gone. He suspected it would always be part of him, but because he'd finally learned that grief and joy could coexist, that honoring the past didn't require abandoning the possibility of a meaningful future. The next morning, Edgar received a call that would give him a chance to test just how much he'd changed. Miriam's voice carried the kind of careful excitement that suggested she had news to share, but wasn't sure how it would be received. "Dad, I know this might seem sudden, but David and I have been talking about getting a pet for the kids. Something to teach them responsibility, you know? And we were wondering, would you help us find the right cat? Someone who could handle 2 energetic children, but still be a good family companion." Edgar felt a smile spreading across his face as he looked at Quill, who was watching him with the alert attention of someone who could sense that something important was being discussed. "I think I know just the program for you," Edgar said. "How about I introduce you to some cats this weekend? As he hung up the phone, Edgar realized that the circle was completing itself in ways he never could have anticipated. He'd started this journey as a man who'd lost everything that gave his life meaning. Now he was becoming someone who helped others discover that meaning could be rebuilt from unexpected sources, that connection could be found in the most unlikely places, that love, whether between humans or between humans and animals, was always worth the risk of loss. Outside his window, the Portland morning was bright with possibilities, and Edgar Mallory, cat dad and professional matchmaker, was ready to meet whatever came next. He had stories to write, lives to touch, and a remarkable grey cat named Quill who'd taught him that sometimes the most important transformations begin with the smallest acts of caring. The man who wouldn't heal had become the man who helped others find their way back to life, one purr at a time. And in that transformation, Edgar had discovered something Catherine had always known but he'd never fully understood, that the heart's capacity to love isn't diminished by loss, it's deepened by it, made more precious by the knowledge that every connection is both fragile and miraculous, temporary and eternal, worth every risk we take to find it.